Hi all, and welcome back to our online lectures for Bio 158. I hope you guys enjoyed the 2 weeks of those videos through Johns Hopkins, helping us understand an epidemic and actually, hopefully, we have a better understanding of how experts called epidemiologists track and respond to particular pandemics like COVID-19. Now, for the last week of instruction, we're going to study our last body system of the semester. And this is a very important one. It's the nervous system. This system is extremely important because what the nervous system does is it controls and coordinates functions throughout the body and responds to internal things going on inside our body and external things that are on the outside in the environment, stimuli. Now, there are three main components that make up the nervous system. These are the brain, or the main control center of our bodies, the spinal cord, and these things called nerves, which are just bundles of neurons. And if we're unfamiliar with what a neuron is an individual nerve cell. It's the basic unit of structure and function of the nervous system. Now, importantly, our nervous system can be split into two sections. The central nervous system, often abbreviated as the CNS, is composed of the brain and spinal cord. And the brain and spinal cord, they're largely responsible for processing specific messages that it gets from our nerves and neurons. The second section of our nervous system is known as the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is composed of all the nerves that bring messages into and back out of the central nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord. So how those messages actually enter in and how they exit the brain and spinal cord. As most of you probably know, the main control center, a very important portion of our nervous system, is our brains, and they are extraordinarily complex. They have many different parts, but the three that I want us to focus on today is the cerebrum, and that is this big portion here. And this is the largest portion of our brain. It controls things like senses, thought, memory, learning, and certain voluntary muscles as well. So if we want to move particular muscles, we'll actually use a portion of our cerebrum. The cerebellum, which is located at the back, so you can see here, circling with my laser pointer. And this controls body movement and balance. And so if you ever get dizzy or disoriented, that's something with our cerebellum that's going on. And then finally, the medulla, this central portion here that's kind of right at the stem of the brain. And this connects the brain to the spinal cord. This is largely responsible for controlling involuntary functions, things like breathing, digestion, and heartbeat, things we don't really need to think about, but our brain is ultimately responsible for. You can also see here down below functions of the different portions of the cerebrum, and we've narrowed it down to each portion of the cerebrum controlling a particular portion of our cells. So for example, the back of our cerebrum is responsible for vision. This middle portion is responsible for touch, how we interpret touching things in our environment, and so forth. Now, the peripheral nervous system can further be divided into two subdivisions, which we'll talk about. The somatic nervous system, which is responsible for voluntary movements. So voluntary means that you're controlling it, so you actively think about it. So if you wanted to move your arm, for example, you would think about, extending your arm. And the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary things. So things we don't really think about, but things that happen nonetheless. And this section, the autonomic nervous system, can be broken down into two further subdivisions. The sympathetic, or what's called the fight or flight response, which we'll get into later on in the lecture, and the parasympathetic. And so here is kind of a nice organization of the nervous system. The central nervous system, where all of our messages, again, are processed and received. So we get sensory input from particular organs into the central nervous system, and we have some sort of response. So we have some sort of response, so we process that information, and we have some response here, whether that be a somatic response, so voluntary, so moving our skeletal muscles, or an autonomic response, an involuntary response. So this is something like increasing heart rate or dilating our air passages so we can get more air if we're preparing to run, for example. And so, and also these responses can, be both of these occurring at the same time. So you can have somatic and autonomic responses occurring based on particular input. And I think this is a lot easier to understand if we have, a nice example here. So let's say that one day we are walking through the woods, we're enjoying nature, and along our path, we see with our eyes, we see a grizzly bear that's standing at the path. Well, you really don't want to mess with a grizzly bear, and so our eyes, see that. They send information, from our stimulus, being the bear that we see. That input is sent to our CNS through our peripheral nervous system. So remember, that's the neurons that carry messages from outside to our central nervous system. So that stimulus is carried to the CNS, to our brain and spinal cord, where we're able to process that information. So it reaches our brain, and our brain says, oh, that's a bear. We definitely don't want to mess with that. And so then our brain interprets that and actually gives messages to both our somatic nervous system, things we can actively control, being our skeletal muscles, and our autonomic nervous system, things we don't really think about but occur, when we're getting ready to, say, run from a bear, for example. And so our somatic nervous system controls our skeletal muscles. We've processed our bear signal, and it tells us, start pumping those legs and prepare yourself to run. And our autonomic nervous system basically starts, telling our heart, start beating faster because we're about to run for our lives. And so we see those two responses kind of come together in our ultimate response, which is to run away from this particular bear. And so now we kind of understand the overall organization of our central and peripheral nervous systems. And now we're going to dive more into the functions of our nervous system in the next section.